Howdy! So today I want to talk to you about ideation. What is ideation? Ideation is the process of coming up with designs for a deliverable or a project while being as creative as possible and working off the ideas of the other people on your team. You want to keep your constraints in mind, but don't let them hold you down. Also note that there are two phases to ideation. In the first phase, the goal is to come up with as many ideas as possible. In the second phase, you want to focus on being more practical. So, for the early stage of ideation, you want absolutely no negative or final judgment, which includes self-judgment. You want to say positive things, but you don't want to say, this is what we're going to do for sure, or that won't work, that's a bad idea. You don't want to be so final. You also want to challenge assumptions. For example, when the team was working on designing a gray water filter, we discussed a lot about how the water filter might interface with the piedra. But it doesn't necessarily have to do that. A good part of early ideation is challenging those types of assumptions. Finally, you want to produce as many ideas as possible. There are no wrong answers and you shouldn't worry about quality. You also shouldn't get too attached to a particular idea because there's a chance that it might be abandoned later and you don't want to feel hurt about it. Also, if you get too attached, you won't abandon an idea when it needs to be, and that's not good. In the later stage of ideation, you want to focus more on your constraints and putting energy into your more practical ideas. For example, if in early ideation you came up with a truly ridiculous concept, now is the time to start thinking about that a lot less. It's okay to go back to early ideation rules during the late stage, though. This is not really a linear process, it's more cyclical. Some good creativity prompts for working in a group during the early stage of ideation are to come up with your worst idea possible, to draw and pass a particular idea, to design for another set of circumstances, to reverse assumptions, to consider an alternate designer, to eliminate materials from the pool of things you can design with, and to work towards the opposite of what your actual goal is. For example, if you were going to design a water filter, you would design a device that makes water as dirty as possible. These are good for creativity prompts because they reduce the pressure to come up with an actual useful deliverable and allow you to be more free with your ideation. Some useful tools for group ideation during the late stage are functional decomposition, pruning, yes and, dot voting, and build events. Functional decomposition is a process through which you identify the jobs that the device needs to do and come up with different components which can complete each job. Then you can think about which components go well together. This is different from thinking about the device as a whole because it allows you to be more free with your ideation for each particular component, and maybe you can find a pattern that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. Pruning is a process through which you take the most useful parts of any given idea and try and meld them together as best you can. This is useful for when you have a lot of very different ideas and you want to figure out which ones are the most useful or to combine them in a more collaborative way. Yes-anding is a process through which you identify things that work and things that don't and build and improve on them. For example, if you know that you have one component of your device that works very well, you would keep that and build upon it instead of starting over for every new idea. Dot voting is most useful when you already have several good ideas, and you can set them out and decide which ones the groups like the most, based on how many votes that particular idea gets from the group. A build event is another very late stage concept during which you make prototypes to get a better feel for what works and what doesn't. These would ideally be low fidelity prototypes, which means they wouldn't be very good or very useful, but they're very cheap and easy to make. For example, instead of using PVC to make a water filter, you would use cardboard tubes, because that's easier, faster, and cheaper. Some good tools for ideation outside of meetings are Tinkercad, benchmarking, talking to people who don't know about the device, and biomimicry. Tinkercad is like the Play-Doh of 3D modeling softwares. It's very easy to use, it's free, it's open, it's online, and you can access and copy and alter other users' designs. It's very useful for solo ideation. Benchmarking is looking at what other groups have done and looking at what's failed and why. It's not only important to look at what's succeeded, but also to look at what hasn't so that you don't make the same mistakes. It can also be useful to talk to someone off the team, like a parent or a friend, who doesn't understand the device and doesn't understand the constraints, so that you can work with them from an outside perspective. It's much easier for a person who doesn't understand what's going on to suspend their ideas of the constraints than it is for a designer who's very, very aware of their constraints and circumstances. Finally, biomimicry is looking at examples of the design problem and solution in nature. For example, pine needles are like nature's fog harp. They're used to collect humidity from the air, and once the dew gathers on them, it drips down to the ground where the tree can absorb it through its roots. In this way, a pine needle is like a fog harp. This is important to recognize because it could help design better fog harps based on what already works in nature through millions of years of evolution. And don't be afraid to make up your own tools for ideation. The whole point of ideation is creativity, so you should not feel bound by what I've listed here.